In this lecture, we're going to talk about vaccines. So, vaccines are a way that we train the immune system to recognize potentially very harmful pathogens. So, the immune system responds to things called antigens. Antigens are usually proteins, and they're usually on the surface of the pathogen. Now, the first time the immune system sees an antigen, and it goes, this is something that is not me and doesn't belong here, it's going to respond, but it's going to take a while to respond. It's not going to be a very fast or very strong response, at least not right away. It takes a while to build that up. Now, if the immune system sees an antigen that it has seen before, it goes, aha, I recognize you. You are the villain of this piece and we must destroy you. And it responds really fast and really strong. And often it can wipe out the pathogen without any symptoms on your behalf. You don't even realize it's worked. A vaccine uses the antigens to train the immune system. It shows the immune system, look, if you see this, it's a bad guy and you should attack it. So there are lots of different ways to make vaccines. I'm only going to mention a few of them. We're going to start at the lower left with what are called attenuated vaccines. Attenuated means weakened. So it makes a weakened virus or bacteria, but it's still alive. The immune system responds pretty strongly to living attenuated viruses. These viruses are not able to cause disease. We've genetically modified them somehow to make it so they can't cause an infection. Live attenuated vaccines produce a long-lasting, strong immune response. These are used in the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine and the chickenpox vaccine. Moving up to the upper left, inactivated vaccines, also called killed or killed whole cell vaccines. These viruses are unable to replicate, unable to infect, unable to cause disease. They're essentially dead. Now, these don't provide as strong of an immune response, which means the immunity might not last as long or you may need more shots. The flu vaccine is an inactivated vaccine. It can't cause the flu because there's no live virus in it. We move on to the subunit vaccines, sometimes called component vaccines. A subunit or a component is part of the virus or bacteria. So it's generally just the antigen or even just part of the antigen. So by attacking these subunits, you can stop the virus or bacteria from getting into your cells. Subunit vaccines are not as long lasting. You may need boosters, but they are very, very safe. Whooping cough, hepatitis B, the shingles vaccine all use this technology. The last one is what's listed here as nucleic acid vaccines. I'm going to talk specifically about the mRNA vaccines. mRNA is messenger RNA. And in your cells, your body uses these to take instructions from the nucleus from your DNA out of the nucleus to the ribosomes where proteins are manufactured. So it's how the information gets moved to the place of manufacturing. So mRNA vaccines are delivering mRNA to your cells. Your cells then go, I'm going to make this protein. But the protein is the antigen. It's the viral, as far as I know, this is only used with viruses so far. It's the viral antigen. Your immune system then, of course, learns to recognize that protein as a threat and will respond very quickly. It's much easier to come up with an mRNA vaccine than to come up with a way to manufacture the antigen in large quantities for vaccine efforts. The COVID-19 vaccines by Pfizer and Moderna are mRNA vaccines. So, when we talk about all of these different vaccines, we're talking about ways to prevent some of the most horrific diseases that we've ever seen. In the upper left, we have a child who had polio and is in an iron lung. We don't use iron lungs anymore, but we had to use them in times past because polio causes paralysis, including of the muscles that allow us to breathe. And so the iron lung used pressure changes so that these paralyzed children could breathe. Many of them recovered, but not all. On the bottom, of course, we have tetanus. Tetanus is uncontrolled muscle contractions, so strong that they can break your bones. And tetanus is often untreated, is often fatal. On the right is one of the last children ever to get smallpox. You can see all of the blisters on their skin. These would leave permanent scars. And this had a very, very high mortality rate. So you can see why we have vaccines against these diseases, I hope. When we look at the efficacy of vaccines, how effective they are, they're going to differ in this efficacy. Some vaccines, you get one shot. Some you get multiple shots. Some vaccines last a year, like the flu vaccine. Some seem to last a lifetime. Regardless, if you have a good response to the vaccine, if your immune system recognizes the vaccine and says, aha, I'm going to remember this, even if it does not completely prevent an illness, it'll make that illness significantly less severe. Some people's immune systems do not necessarily recognize every vaccine. And we don't know who's going to respond and who's not. It is estimated that 3 million people worldwide die every year of a vaccine preventable death. Half of them are children. That's over 4,000 children dying every day from something that we could prevent with a vaccine. Oh, but what about the side effects? Well, for most people, for most vaccines, the side effects are pretty mild. Sore arm, brief fever, especially in young children, dizziness at the time of the vaccination. But when you consider that these things can save your life, those side effects are not that severe. Now, there is a condition that is associated with certain vaccines called Guillain-Barré syndrome. You're going to have to look in the notes for how to spell that one. Guillain-Barré is an autoimmune condition where the body's immune system attacks peripheral nerves. So nerves outside of the central nervous system. So not in the brain or the spinal cord, but in the arms and legs and in the torso. This results in paralysis. It can lead to death. Now, Guillain-Barré, the causes of it are not well understood. We do know that infection with the flu can trigger this. We do know that there is a very small risk with the meningococcal vaccine, probably in the range of 1 out of every 2 million vaccinations. People associate it with vaccination, but that's not the normal cause of Guillain-Barré. It doesn't usually occur because of a vaccination. It occurs for reasons we don't fully understand. All right. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago how not everyone's immune system responds well to vaccination. And not everyone can safely be vaccinated. When we look at people who are very young, elderly, have a chronic illness, they don't tend to respond well to vaccines. They don't tend to build a strong immune response. So there's this idea called herd immunity, where a significant percentage of a population is vaccinated, and this protects those people who were unable to get vaccinated or didn't respond well to the vaccine. If you don't have a lot of people who are vulnerable to an infection, they're protected by vaccination, it makes it really hard for the virus or bacteria to spread. And so it protects the vulnerable. The greater the percentage of population that is immune, the less likely one infectious individual will encounter someone who is susceptible or likely to get that infection. And it often can can stop a disease from becoming an outbreak or an epidemic. So how much herd immunity you need depends on the pathogen, but it's generally between 80 and over 90% of the population has to be immune. The larger percentage immunity is for diseases where the infected individual is contagious longer. Now, does natural immunity count? If you got the flu, are you part of the protected group? Well, that depends on the disease. Generally speaking, vaccines give you a stronger immune memory. Your immune system remembers vaccines more than it remembers an infection, and it'll respond stronger. Natural immunity is not as good as vaccine immunity, which I know is surprising to a lot of people. So, vaccination protects you, it protects your loved ones, it protects complete strangers. This is some data from 2010 looking at changes in the lethality or the deadliness of several diseases in the US. The boxes at the top are before there was a vaccine available. The boxes at the bottom are after there's a vaccine available. And you can see that deaths fell quite a bit. We look at mumps, and before a vaccine, it was killing over 160,000 Americans every year. After the vaccine, 2,600. Now, it's even less now, because the longer you have a vaccine for something, the more the population is protected. Not on this would be whooping cough. Whooping cough is a disease that can be fatal for the very young and the very old. But even healthy adults can be sick for months. The cough is hard, strong, and it can cause people to lose their bladder control and break ribs. And when I say young, healthy adults, this is a disease that can cause these problems in college age healthy adults. And you can cough for months. Rabies, also not on here, is a disease that is nearly 100% fatal if you don't get post-exposure vaccination. We used to say rabies was 100% fatal, but there have been a few people who have survived without post-exposure vaccination due to improved health conditions. And when I say a handful, I think you only need one hand to count the number of survivors on. I think it's like 5, but it's certainly less than 10. When we look at COVID, our current pandemic, the mortality rate, the percentage of the American population who has died from COVID who is not vaccinated is 0.5%. 1 out of every 500 unvaccinated Americans. Vaccinated, the mortality rate is 0.004. Much, much lower. And of course, mortality does not include the long-term, possibly permanent disabilities that we can see with COVID, the long COVID problem. Now, there is in the US something called VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. If you get vaccinated and you have an adverse event, some kind of side effect, you can report it to VAERS. You can go online, fill out the form. You don't need any documentation at all. This system was originally set up to detect unexpected problems with vaccines, especially new vaccines. Of course, it is being abused today by the anti-vax movement. They're reporting all kinds of weird things going on, and there's no supporting evidence for these. I mean, they're saying things like 45,000 Americans died yesterday from vaccination, and there's no evidence of that. There have been 3 confirmed deaths due to COVID vaccines. This is out of 188 million Americans who are fully vaccinated. So that's a very low risk. In addition to VAERS, there's something called the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. This was set up by the US government to encourage the development of vaccines by pharmaceuticals and biomedical companies. Vaccines are expensive to develop and are not as profitable as other types of drugs. So again, anyone can apply for compensation with the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. Now for this one, you have to have documentation. And if you have documentation that you got some side effect, especially a severe side effect, shortly after you got vaccinated, and you have doctor's bills and proof that you actually got vaccinated, most cases there's a payout and there is some money available for you. The most recent data I have from this was looking at the years between 2006 and 2017, so about a decade. There were over 3.4 billion doses of vaccine. Remember, 1,000,000 seconds is 12 days. 1,000,000,000 seconds is 32 years. That's a big number. During this same time period, there were 4,539 compensations, or about one compensation for every 1,000,000 doses of vaccine. And what kinds of injuries are we talking about? Well, on the most severe side of things, there's anaphylaxis, which is an immune response that can cause you a lot of problems with breathing. There were 5 cases of anaphylaxis. There's some cases of what's called brachial neuritis, which is pain or loss of shoulder mobility. This usually happens if the vaccine was given too close to a nerve in the shoulder. And a lot of these cases are temporary. In fact, most of them are temporary. There can be fainting, and there can be a few other severe things. You can develop chronic arthritis, a bleeding disorder, and of course we talked about Guillain-Barré. But remember, this is all of these categories, both short-term and longer-term. One compensation per 1,000,000 doses of vaccines. Anaphylaxis is short-term. Brachial neuritis is usually short-term. Fainting is very short-term. The arthritis, the bleeding disorder, and the Guillain-Barré usually will last for, a few months or a year, and then you recover from them. And that's a heck of a lot better than the 1 out of every 500 people who have died from COVID in the United States in the past 2 years. So that's vaccination. Hopefully, that will help you understand what's going on with vaccinations and feel a little safer about them. Oh, and yeah, vaccines do not cause autism. There have been studies looking at hundreds of thousands of children, comparing vaccinated children with unvaccinated children. The rates of autism are the same in each group. The original study that showed a link only looked at, I think it was a dozen children. And of course, the guy got charged with lying, and the paper was retracted. But that's a whole nother story, and I've already run pretty long on this lecture, so we're going to stop here.